So I've given you a potted history of Stalin and his rule. I've given you some explanation as to why Stalin employed particular methods when it came to the control of the Soviet Union. And we've looked at some of the iconography, some of the images that the Soviet governments used to portray positively or negatively parts of Soviet society. I suppose we actually need to talk about photographs now, since supposedly this is what we're here for. Now, I'm going to give some examples from a book by David King, and I'm referencing this throughout. This is The Commissar Vanishes. On the website for this Coursera unit, will give you a link to David King's own website. But just for reference, there is another URL which I'm going to publicise via this site, which gives some of the images, and you can go and review those a little bit later. I'm going to concentrate on a half dozen or so examples of how Stalin chose to manipulate images and to speculate why those were done. And the first one appears to be quite a prosaic image. This comes from the 16th Party Congress in 1930. On the first photograph, you can see the attendant is pointing in a particular direction while standing adjacent but not next to Stalin. The photograph was then altered. Now, I've mentioned that people who'd fallen from favour were airbrushed out of history. Why would an attendant supposedly showing directions need to be removed? The implication and the interpretation here is that the humble worker was there to tell Stalin where to go. This is the way that King puts it in that regard. So concerned was Stalin about his image, he couldn't possibly have a workman being given to be seen to give him direction in any way. The allegory was too great for that to stand. So, regretfully, that poor individual was airbrushed out of history. It's not just those who are near Stalin that required, quotes, correction, so to speak. I've already mentioned the importance of Lenin to the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, and to a certain degree to the credence that was given to Stalin after his ascent to power. Stalin portrayed himself as keeping in the tradition of Lenin. The point I make is that Stalin was more an organizer, whereas Lenin was much more of a theorist and a thinker. In some respects, the outlook of the two men couldn't have been more different. But nevertheless, Lenin held such a hallowed state in Soviet society that you could gain credibility simply by being seen to be stood by his side. Okay, now this is a photograph from 1920. As you can see, it's a large group photograph. Yet we have a little insert here, and it's reproduced with a few more people over here as well, where Maxim Gorky is seen to be standing at the shoulder of Lenin, and particularly in this photograph, that it's very much he and Lenin alone. Stalin and Gorky became friends in the late 1920s, so to emphasize the importance of Gorky, these photographs were retouched accordingly. This reconstruction of history to suit Stalin's current perspectives goes back to very old images. These two are from the St. Petersburg Union of Struggle for the Liberation of Workers, or working classes rather, and goes back to 1897. Now, Malchenko was accused in 1929 of being, quote, a wrecker, and was executed the following year. So between the two photographs, you can just about see that Malchenko has been again removed from the historical record. He'd fallen from favour after Lenin's death, and the last thing that Stalin wanted was a photograph even implying that again he was at Lenin's shoulder. Now, 1959, Malchenko is, quotes, rehabilitated, unquotes. So after Stalin's death, this original photograph becomes currency again and is the official photograph of the meeting. This is another of the disappeared. In this case, it's Petrovsky. These photographs are from the 1922 Party Congress. Now, in 1938, Petrovsky was sacked from the Central Committee. And again, the way that King puts it is in terms of accused of having connections with enemies of the people. The following year, this photograph was put up, the official photograph, which has Petrovsky moved and the gentleman next to him moved a little bit closer to Stalin. So it's a fairly rapid rewriting of history within Stalin's own lifetime. Trotsky. Trotsky really did fall from grace in Soviet eyes. And this little pair of photographs here show Trotsky and his wife in the rear seat of a car. It's taken in Georgia in 1924. When the photograph is reprinted 12 years later, the gentleman who's standing at the side and the rear of the car has been repositioned so he obscures Trotsky. It should be pointed out that at the time the second image came out, Trotsky was in exile and I believe living in Norway. So those who had fallen foul of Stalin, however seriously or trivially, did find themselves again obscured from the historical record. It wasn't purely in terms of Stalin's perspective on who was acceptable and who wasn't acceptable. Nikolai Yevtsov was removed from his office in the Soviet apparatus in 1938, which is the year of this top photograph. He's actually standing next to Nikita Khrushchev, who was to succeed Stalin as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The photograph below is in 1949, so after Yevtsov had fallen from grace, and he is replaced by wood panelling. Although it's fairly small, it's significant in terms of the positioning of Yeltsin. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The positioning of Yevtsov next to Khrushchev, considering Khrushchev's slow ascendancy in the late 1940s. And the book is called The Commissar Vanishes, and here is another photograph of Yevtsov. The irony was that he was the Commissioner for Water Transport. So as David King points out in the revised photograph, which is adjacent here, he's actually replaced by, well, the water he was in charge of. Again, why would you go to this difficulty of changing the historical record? It tells you something about Stalin's paranoia, about being perceived as having made errors in the past and been associated with those who've fallen foul of his rule and therefore fallen out of his favour. Now, I must admit, I quite like irony. At least in preparing for today's seminar, one or two questions were asked of, well, do we have any legitimate photographs of Stalin standing next to Lenin? This is a painting actually done in 1947, and again, it's the Second Congress of the Soviets, Proclaiming Soviet Power is the title. And it won the Stalin Prize in 1948. Here is Lenin. You can see Stalin, again, figuratively by his elbow, by his shoulder. The picture was repainted in 1962 under pressure from Khrushchev, and guess who gets removed from the picture? The fate that Stalin applied to a number of people in his own time was applied to him after his death. In terms of this proximity to Lenin, here are a number of examples in physical form, although they're photograph of memorials and monuments. The first one is a photograph. It's suggested by David King that this has been falsified. But we have a statue, again, of Lenin and Stalin conversing, apparently Lenin taking Stalin's counsel. If you turn over to drawings in the same measure, here we have an issue of Stalin placed higher than Lenin and appeared to be offering advice once more. And finally, another statue, again, Lenin sitting, Stalin standing, and just notice the position of the arm here in terms of Lenin giving a sort of reassuring support to Stalin, as if, once more, that Stalin's rule is at least blessed by Lenin. It wasn't just Stalin's image relative to people who'd fallen from favour that was altered. Here are two examples between the early 20s and the late 1930s of how Stalin had his own image airbrushed. The caption in David King's book says Hollywood USSR, and certainly the larger image we might politely describe as being somewhat more flattering. There's also the issue about why you would go to the trouble of actually having images airbrushed when you can actually start from scratch. So here's a sequence that David King has of the group of 4, the group of 3, the group of 2, and suddenly the photograph becomes a portrait of Stalin on his own. Now, I'm not quite sure how the authenticity of an image being transformed 3 times makes a difference, but nevertheless, this is one of the ways that Stalin wanted to maintain continuity of his place in history, even though everyone else seems to have gone bye-bye. And finally, never mind subtlety, these portraits have literally had people blotted out. There is no easy way of recognising these people. David King has been very thorough to find the originals and to identify what the people looked like before they were defaced, and in this case, literally defaced in these images. So people were simply blotted out when their faces no longer fitted.